The dust of the Sahel swirled like ancestral spirits around the compound walls of the Synagogue Church of All Nations in Lagos. Inside the prayer hall, thousands of believers from across West Africa pressed forward, their voices rising in harmonious Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo tongues, creating a symphony that seemed to shake the very foundations of heaven itself. Prophet Temitope Balogun Joshua, TB Joshua to the world, stood at the altar, his white robes billowing like clouds pregnant with rain. His eyes, usually warm and welcoming, had taken on that distant look his congregants knew well. The look that meant the Spirit was moving, that prophecy was about to break forth like lightning across a storm-darkened sky. I see. I see. His voice carried across the vast hall, silencing 10,000 voices as if someone had turned off a radio. The young lion of Burkina Faso. Yes, I see him clearly now. In the front row, Mama Aduni gripped her prayer cloth tighter. She had come all the way from Ouagadougou, her savings depleted, her heart heavy with concerns for her homeland. The elderly woman's weathered hands bore the marks of decades spent selling groundnuts in the dusty markets, but her spirit burned with the fire of ancient griots who carried the stories of kings and warriors in their voices. Prophet, she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her among the multitude, speak truth over our land. TB Joshua's breathing became labored, his chest rising and falling as if he were climbing an invisible mountain. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries, the authority of the ancestors speaking through willing flesh. I see a young man, a soldier, but not like other soldiers. His heart burns with the fire of liberation, but... The prophet paused, his brow furrowing deeply. But the path he walks is treacherous. The spirits of the colonial masters still whisper in the corridors of power, still pull the strings of those who should be free. The congregation held its breath. They knew of whom he spoke. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary who had seized power in Burkina Faso, promising to drive out the French influence that had strangled their nation for decades. This young lion, TB Joshua continued, his voice growing stronger, he carries the hopes of a generation on his shoulders. But I see shadows, dark shadows gathering around him like vultures circling carrion. In the spiritual realm that TB Joshua now navigated, time moves differently. Past, present, and future swirled together like colors in a master artist's palette. He could see young Ibrahim as a child in Burkina Faso, running barefoot through the red earth of his village, his eyes already carrying the weight of questions too large for his small frame. Why do the white men still control our minds, grandfather? The boy had asked an elder whose back was bent like a baobab tree weathered by countless seasons. The old man had looked toward the horizon where the sun kissed the earth, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Because, my child, we have forgotten the power of our own voices. We have let others speak for us for so long that we have begun to believe we have nothing to say. The vision shifted, and TB Joshua saw the young man growing, joining the military, his spirit chafing against the corruption and foreign manipulation he witnessed. He saw the moment when Ibrahim's heart finally hardened against the old order, when he watched French military advisors laugh as they discussed how to maintain their grip on Burkina Faso's gold mines while children in the villages went hungry. I see his ascension to power, TB Joshua declared, his voice booming across the silent congregation. September 30, 2022, the day the young lion roared and shook the foundations of neocolonialism. But the spirits warn, they warn of danger ahead. The prophet's body trembled, and two deacons moved forward to steady him, but he waved them away with one hand while the other pointed toward an invisible horizon. The French are not sleeping, he cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. Even now, they plot in their ivory towers, they whisper to their agents embedded like termites in the government structures. They will not let this young man succeed without a fight. The vision deepened, and TB Joshua found himself standing in what appeared to be the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The walls seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a nation in transition, and he could hear the voices of advisors, some genuine in their patriotism, others speaking with tongues forked like serpents. Ibrahim Traoré sat at a mahogany table. Ironic, TB Joshua noted, that it was probably made from wood stolen from Burkina Faso's own forests during colonial times and now served as the seat of its liberation. The young leader's face bore the weight of impossible decisions. His military fatigues were simple, unadorned with the gaudy decorations that had characterized previous leaders who had sold their souls to foreign masters. Captain, one advisor was saying, his voice smooth as palm oil but carrying an undertone that made TB Joshua's spirit recoil, perhaps we should reconsider our position on the mining contracts. The French companies employ thousands of people. We cannot simply what? Ibrahim's voice cut through the advisor's words like a machete through tall grass. Cannot simply demand that our own resources benefit our own people? Cannot simply insist that the wealth beneath our feet should feed our children instead of foreign shareholders? TB Joshua watched as the advisor's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the veneer of concern. Young lion, the prophet whispered into the spiritual realm, be careful who you trust. The Judas among your disciples has not yet revealed himself. Back in the Lagos church, TB Joshua's physical body swayed as if buffeted by invisible winds. The congregation watched in hushed reverence as their prophet wrestled with the visions flooding through him. I see attempts on his life, he announced suddenly, causing several congregants to gasp. Not one, not two, but multiple attempts. The enemies of African liberation will not rest while this young man breathes and speaks truth to power. Mama Aduni felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought of her grandson, barely 20 years old, who had joined the youth movement supporting Traoré's vision of a truly independent Burkina Faso. She thought of the hope that had flickered to life in the eyes of young people across West Africa when they heard of a leader who dared to say no to the former colonial masters. But prophet, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of an elder despite her position in the crowd, will he succeed? Will our children finally be free? TB Joshua turned toward her voice, though his eyes still held that distant, otherworldly gaze. When he spoke, his words carried both warning and promise. The path of liberation is never easy, Mama. It is watered with the blood of martyrs and built on the bones of heroes. This young man, this Ibrahim Traoré, has been chosen by the ancestors not for an easy life, but for a necessary one. The vision shifted again, and TB Joshua found himself in a place beyond time, where the spirits of great African leaders gathered in council. He recognized them: Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau. All men who had dared to dream of true African independence, all men who had paid the ultimate price for their vision. Thomas Sankara stepped forward, his spirit radiating the same integrity and fire that had characterized his earthly life. In this realm, he appeared as he had been in life, tall, proud, with eyes that seemed to hold the dawn of a new Africa. The young one walks the same path we walked, Sankara's spirit spoke, his voice carrying across dimensions. He faces the same enemies, the same temptations, the same impossible choices. Will he succeed where we could not? Asked Lumumba's spirit, the pain of his assassination still visible in his ethereal form. Sankara turned toward TB Joshua, acknowledging the prophet's presence in this sacred space. That depends on whether he learns from our mistakes. We trusted too easily, spoke too openly of our plans, failed to understand that the enemy's greatest weapon is not the gun but the traitor who shares your bread. TB Joshua felt the weight of this knowledge settling on his spirit like a heavy cloak. He understood now why the vision had come with such intensity, why the ancestral spirits had chosen to speak through him at this moment. Returning to the natural realm, TB Joshua opened his eyes fully for the first time since the vision began. The congregation waited in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something profound, something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Young Captain Ibrahim Traoré, TB Joshua spoke as if addressing the man directly, if these words reach you, and they will, for the wind carries truth faster than any messenger, hear the warning of the Most High and the wisdom of your ancestors. He paused, gathering strength for the words that needed to be spoken. Your greatest enemy will not come wearing the uniform of a foreign soldier. He will not speak with an accent that betrays his origins. Your greatest enemy will look like you, speak your language, share your meals, and claim to share your vision. He will be close enough to touch your shoulder while he aims the knife at your back. The prophet's voice grew stronger, more urgent. The French connections run deeper than you know. They have cultivated assets for decades, people whose children were educated in Paris, whose loyalties were purchased with promises of wealth and position. Some of these people sit in your own councils, speak at your own table, and pray in your own name. TB Joshua's vision focused on a specific scene that sent chills through his prophetic spirit. He saw Ibrahim Traoré in a private meeting with his inner circle, discussing plans to nationalize more mining operations and establish closer ties with Russia and China. Moves that would strike at the heart of French economic interests in the region. Among the men in the room, TB Joshua could see the spiritual marks that distinguished the loyal from the treacherous. Most of the advisors glowed with the warm light of genuine patriotism, their spirits aligned with the noble cause of African liberation. But one man, a colonel who had been instrumental in bringing Traoré to power, carried shadows that writhed around him like serpents. Even now, TB Joshua announced to his congregation, the Judas plans his betrayal. He carries an encrypted phone that connects him to handlers in Paris. He reports not just on military matters but on the president's state of mind, his fears, his plans, his vulnerabilities. The prophet's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. This man fought beside Ibrahim in the revolution. He shared the dangers, spoke the same words about African dignity and independence. But his heart was purchased long ago, and now he waits for the signal to strike. In the spiritual realm, TB Joshua witnessed a conversation taking place in a secure facility in Paris. French intelligence officials sat around a polished table, their faces grave as they discussed what they called the Burkina problem. Traoré is becoming too independent, one official was saying in French, his words translated automatically in the prophetic realm. First it was the mining contracts, now he's talking about currency reform, establishing an African monetary union. If we let this continue, it will spread to Mali, Niger, even Senegal. Another man, older and bearing the scars of someone who had fought in France's colonial wars, leaned forward. We have assets in place. The colonel has been with us for 7 years. He's been invaluable in the past, and he understands what needs to be done. And if he fails? Then we activate the other options. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. A military coup is cleaner than an assassination. Less likely to create a martyr. TB Joshua felt his spirit recoil at the coldness in these men's voices, the casual way they discussed the destruction of African hope as if it were a business transaction. But even as the darkness of these plots swirled around the vision, TB Joshua began to see something else. Pinpricks of light that grew brighter as he focused on them. These were the points where divine intervention was possible, where prayer and spiritual warfare could alter the course of events. I see a young woman, he announced suddenly, his voice filled with new energy. An intelligence officer in Ibrahim's security detail. She has been watching, listening, and she has begun to suspect the colonel. Her spirit is pure, her loyalty unquestionable. The vision showed him as Captain Aminata Zerbo, a 28-year-old intelligence officer whose grandfather had fought alongside Thomas Sankara. She had noticed inconsistencies in the colonel's reports, subtle changes in his behavior that her trained eye found suspicious. This young woman is key, TB Joshua continued. She carries the bloodline of warriors and the wisdom of the ancestors. If she is listened to, if her warnings are heeded, the trap can be avoided. As TB Joshua delved deeper into the prophetic realm, he began to understand that the conflict surrounding Ibrahim Traoré was not merely political or economic. It was fundamentally spiritual. The forces of neocolonialism had spiritual dimensions, drawing power from decades of psychological conditioning and the accumulated trauma of colonial oppression. The battle for Burkina Faso is the battle for the soul of Africa, he declared, his voice taking on the cadence of the ancient griots who had preserved the continent's history in song and story. When a young African leader stands up and says, "No more," to foreign exploitation, he is not just challenging economic systems. He is challenging the spiritual strongholds that have convinced our people that we are not worthy of self-determination, that we need foreign masters to think for us, to manage our resources, to define our destiny. The congregation began to sway, feeling the rhythm of truth in the prophet's words. Several women began to ululate, their voices joining in the ancient African praise that had strengthened warriors before battle for countless generations. TB Joshua's vision shifted to show him the broader implications of Ibrahim Traoré's revolution. He saw ripple effects spreading across West Africa, young people in Ghana, Senegal, Mali, and Ivory Coast looking to Burkina Faso as proof that true independence was possible. But he also saw the counter-reactions, increased military presence by foreign powers, economic pressures, propaganda campaigns designed to portray African self-determination as chaos and extremism. The young lion does not fight alone, TB Joshua announced, his voice rising above the growing vocal response from the congregation. His success or failure will determine whether this generation of Africans breaks free from the chains of mental slavery or remains bound for another 50 years. He paused, allowing the weight of this truth to settle over the gathering. This is why the enemy fights so hard against him. They know that if Burkina Faso succeeds in achieving true independence economically, political, and psychologically, it will inspire a continental awakening that will end their era of exploitation forever. As the vision began to wind down, TB Joshua felt the Spirit urging him to move beyond warning into action. Prophecy without corresponding prayer and spiritual warfare was merely information, What was needed was intervention. "People of God," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of one who had stood in the presence of the Almighty, "we have been shown these things not to frighten us but to mobilize us. The battle for Africa's future is being fought in the spiritual realm, and we have been called to be warriors in this fight." He raised his hands, and the congregation rose as one, 10,000 voices ready to join in spiritual warfare for their continent's destiny. "We will pray for protection over Ibrahim Traoré. We will pray for wisdom to distinguish between loyal friends and hidden enemies. We will pray for the exposure of every plot, the failure of every scheme designed to return Burkina Faso to foreign bondage." The prayer that followed shook the building. Voices in dozens of African languages rose together, creating a sound like thunder, like the roar of mighty waters, like the voices of millions of ancestors joining their descendants in a battle cry for freedom. As the prayer reached its crescendo, TB Joshua felt one final vision crystallizing in his spirit. He saw Ibrahim Traoré standing at a crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. Down one path lay a glorious future, a truly independent Burkina Faso that became a beacon of hope for all of Africa. Down the other lay martyrdom, but a martyrdom that would inspire others to take up the fallen banner. "Young lion," TB Joshua spoke as if directly into Ibrahim's ear, "the choice is not whether you will face danger, that is certain. The choice is whether you will face it prepared or unprepared, with wisdom or with naivety, with spiritual armor or spiritual nakedness." He opened his eyes and looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting this service across Africa and the diaspora. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, if you are watching, if these words reach you, surround yourself with people whose spirits are clean, whose loyalties run deeper than money or fear. Trust in the wisdom of the elders but verify their counsel with prayer. Remember that your greatest protection is not in the strength of your army but in the righteousness of your cause and your connection to the Most High." As the service drew to a close, TB Joshua felt the prophetic anointing lifting from him like morning mist before the sun. But the weight of what he had seen remained, and he knew that this prophecy would resonate far beyond the walls of his church. "The Lion of Burkina Faso stands at the threshold of destiny," he concluded, his voice now gentle but still carrying absolute authority. "Whether he crosses into glory or into martyrdom, his roar has already awakened something in the heart of Africa that will never sleep again." He raised his hands in blessing over the congregation and, by extension, over the young revolutionary leader who had captured the hopes of a generation. "May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who delivered Israel from Egypt and called them to be a light to the nations, also deliver Africa from the modern-day pharaohs and establish this continent as the blessing to the world that it was always meant to be." The congregation erupted in praise, but TB Joshua's mind was already on the work ahead. Prophecy had been given, now prayer and action were required. The fate of a young revolutionary, and perhaps the future of Africa itself, hung in the balance. In the spiritual realm, the battle lines had been drawn. The question now was whether enough people would heed the warning and join the fight before it was too late. Days later, videos of TB Joshua's prophecy spread across social media platforms throughout Africa and the diaspora. In Ouagadougou, young people gathered in cafes and market squares to discuss the prophet's words. Some dismissed them as religious theater. Others felt a deep resonance with the warnings about hidden enemies and the need for spiritual preparation. In the presidential palace, security protocols were quietly reviewed. Phone records were examined more carefully. And in the intelligence office, Captain Aminata Zerbo found herself paying closer attention to patterns she had previously dismissed as coincidental. The prophecy had been delivered. Its fulfillment now depended on whether those with eyes to see would watch, those with ears to hear would listen, and those with power to act would have the courage to do what was necessary to protect not just one young leader, but the dream of African liberation he represented. The ancestors waited. The spirits watched. And in churches, mosques, and traditional shrines across West Africa, people began to pray with a new intensity for the young lion of Burkina Faso, understanding that his fate was intertwined with their own hopes for a truly free and prosperous Africa. The prophecy was complete, but the story it foretold was just beginning.